Board to order on September 29th, 2020 at 5:32 p.m. We need to approve the agenda for this meeting, and so it is recommended that, I'm sorry, I would need to recap that we are meeting virtually pursuant to Minnesota Statute 13D.021, I believe it is. Thank you, Laura, for pandemic reasons. So now it's recommended that the school board approve the agenda for the special meeting for this evening. On the agenda is the budget update by Patricia Magnuson, Director of Business Services. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Moved by Karen, second by Ann. Could you do the roll call, please, Laura?
Mary Tomback.
Aye.
Ann Casey.
Aye.
Ken Morrison.
Ken is not with us this evening yet.
Karen Waters.
Aye.
Heather Wilsey.
Aye.
Colin Cox.
Aye.
Laura McClendon. Aye.
Thank you. Passes 6-0. Okay, let's see. I think Patricia, you are up and ready to go.
I am ready. Thanks so much. Good evening. Chair Tomback, Superintendent Osai, members of the board. We're going to do a little update tonight. I'm going to share my screen. This is the PowerPoint that is included in your materials. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So on with us tonight is Yuki Dozier. He's our internal auditor, and also Brooks Grossinger, who you know, who is our controller. And they are a big part of pulling all of this together, and they're here tonight just to listen and follow along, and they'll jump in when I get something wrong. But they're the brains, a lot of the brains behind this. Tonight and this time of the year, we are living in 3 fiscal years. So we're closing up the books for fiscal year 2020 for last year that ended June 30th. In fact, the audit started yesterday. We're in the middle of fiscal year 2021 and thinking about what budget updates we might want to do for this year. And now with the preliminary levy this evening, we're starting the first phases for actually next school year, for fiscal year 2022. So we're already starting to plan for next school year. And so here's the 3 fiscal years. So tonight, here's what we're going to be talking about with fiscal year 2020 that runs from July 1st, 19 to June 30th, 2020. We're going to talk about some things we're beginning to know about the year-end financial results and any future board action that might be coming associated with that. For the year that we're in, we're going to give you some foreshadowing of what might be coming with the mid-year budget update sometime December, January, February. We'll give you an insight into what fall enrollment is looking like this year and some future board action associated with this current fiscal year. And then the big agenda item for tonight is for next fiscal year. Actually, it's approving the preliminary pay 2021 levy. We'll start to look at the timeline for fiscal year 2022 and any future board action coming along with the levy and the budget. So that makes sense? So this is, you have a timeline in the budget book or in the materials that I sent out, and I just wanted to look at the big picture of it for just a minute in this meeting. I won't do this at the regular board meeting. If I can open it here. So this timeline, there's a few changes that I don't know if the board has seen to what the format of the timeline has looked like before. So now the way it appears, we have where you see orange, that's all the places that the school board either weighs in by giving us an update. And when it's in dark orange, that's where the board is making a decision relative to the budget. And this is for fiscal year 2022. And then we added some phases along the side. So we're right now in this data gathering phase where we're settling into the school year, trying to determine what the enrollment looks like for this year, what the final numbers are for last year, so we can begin to project what we might need to do as we prepare for next year's budget. And then from about December till the end of February, we'll begin preparing the budget And then we'll be asking the board to start making approvals as early as February. And then we do a little continuous improvement process at the end so we can come back and start this process over again. And it's really important that we not get ahead of ourselves in this process. And that's what I really want to emphasize for you tonight is we have time to make all the decisions that we need to make. The budget's in place for this year, and we're in a good position to be able to adjust for what we need to adjust, and we'll bring forward all of the things that we're used to seeing. And then in the gray, you can see the Finance Advisory Committee will help us along the way to make sure the things we're presenting make sense. And we've started the process of bringing Finance Advisory Committee together. The old team is all back again for next year, and we're going to start promoting for new membership. And if anybody is listening and knows someone that would want to join the Finance Advisory Committee, the application materials are on the website. So we'll start meeting on October 21st. So that's the big picture of the timeline. So you can sort of see, where we're heading to a budget approval for fiscal year 2022, which is next year. But it involves closing last year and it involves adjusting this year along the way. So now I'm going to just pull back up the presentation here. Okay, so what you can see then in that first part of data gathering, we've got fiscal year 2020. Some work is happening. We'll be bringing the audit to the board at the November 18th meeting. That's where we'll be weighing in on fiscal year 2020. We're doing that work right now. The audit, the final audit started yesterday. Fiscal year 2021, we'll be doing some work on that around November 9th. We hope to start previewing the mid-year budget update for the board. We'll have a lot more information by then. We'll know a lot more about how last year ended, what our enrollment numbers are beginning to look like. We aren't going to ask the board to make decisions about mid-year until after the first of the year, so until January or February, but you'll get a really good preview by November. And then fiscal year 2022, as I said, starts tonight. And then we'll be, that part ends with the final levy that is set in December with the Truth in Taxation, following the Truth in Taxation hearing. So you can see it can get confusing that we're living in 3 fiscal years at one time. That's why I didn't know. Okay, and so then we'll start the budget preparation after that, after all of our data is together. And then finally, we'll have our budget approval on June 28th. And then we'll continuously improve. We'll take feedback from the board and budget managers. So now I'm going to just go back and we'll start with first things. So first thing is fiscal year 2020 preliminary information. The final fieldwork began yesterday, and results are looking to be close to expectations. So there's nothing surprising is rising up. The enrollment is down just a little bit from the final projections, which is sort of normal. We're still cleaning up Mars errors, so I expect that to tighten up. But for now, we're setting our year end at about 35 students below where we had projected. I imagine that will catch up and we'll just make an adjustment in next year's audit, but it's very close. So there's nothing surprising. With all of state aid, it looks like we're going to come in very close to projections. There's a couple of things happening on the expenditure side. Severance payments are a little bit higher than what a typical year would be, and that might be expected with all of the changes that we've been going through, that retirements might have been a little bit higher than in previous years. So we had budgeted for $600,000 in severance payments. And again, I want to remind everyone that we do not have any contracts that have severance payments in them anymore. That language was grand-personed out of contracts several years ago, but we do have payouts, and we have a reserve in the general fund for just that purpose. So we ended up paying about $806,000 in severance payments. So that's one thing that we're looking at on the expenditure side. The other thing the board should know is our self-funded medical reserve is in a really good position. We started the year, this year, we've had self-funded dental for a while. We're in now a self-funded medical program for our staff, and we have about a $2 million reserve in place. which is much better than we thought we would be after 1 year. So it's going really, really well. That money sits outside of the general fund. However, we do keep it in reserve for our staff and for this purpose, and it helps us to keep the spikes and the drops, the valleys and the spikes out of our medical insurance premiums for our staff. So that's doing really well. Here's some things we want to be thinking about as we close the books. We'll be talking to the superintendent about some items, and then we'll bring them to the board for final, once the audit is final in November. We're thinking about, would this be a year that we want to use our fund balance that's assigned for severance? As the board knows, we've been holding on to that about $2 million fund balance so that we can be sure that it takes us through the end of the payouts of the contracts that are in place for employees that had severance in their contracts when it was removed. So those grant-personed employees are still retiring, and $2 million isn't quite enough for all of the payouts for those that we believe in the future might stay long enough to qualify for severance. So we've been letting that severance expense run into the unreserved general fund balance. So we might be talking about, is this a year that we want to take some of the initial $600,000 out of severance, or maybe the excess between the budgeted 600 and 800,000? So what we want to do is look at the numbers at the end of the year, look at where we're heading for this year, and we're in a good position that we can really thoughtfully make some decisions about that. But I want you to know that's one of the things we're weighing. The other thing is that we have a trust set up from years ago. The board wisely set up another post-employment benefits trust. It was a bond issue that put funds in trust along with severance. There's also some employees in old contracts that have long since been negotiated away, but some employees that still have that language under grant-person clauses in contracts that receive retiree health benefits. So we have a trust set aside to cover those costs. Now, what we've normally been doing is taking expenditures for the premiums that are paid on behalf of those retired employees and paying them against the trust. So we just need to weigh, do we want to do that again or not? That's called an explicit subsidy. The other thing, because in Minnesota we have to pool all of our retirees with our active employees, there's this idea of implicit rate subsidy, which says that employees like me and others have a little bit higher rate because we're pooled with the more senior population of retirees. And we've never taken that implicit rate subsidy, so you can sort of pull off that actuarially calculated implicit subsidy from the premiums that the district pays on behalf of current employees and pay it out of the trust. Now, we've never done that before, but it's a lever we might want to think about pulling as we look at this year end. Do we want to build up the fund balance a little bit as we go into fiscal year 2021? So it's another thing that we might consider. So that's sort of where we're at with fiscal 21. There's nothing to be worried about. Things look very typical. We'll be coming to you with some thinking about what we might take as next steps, and then you'll have the audit results to accept in November. And things are going really well with the audit. Thank you to Brooks and his team.
Patricia, can I ask you a question about the severance issue?
Yes.
The severance payments issue. So I understand that that provision is not part of our current contracts.
Yes.
But you're also kind of using retirement and severance in the same way. And my traditional understanding of severance is that you pay it when you ask somebody to leave and they have, you're paying them to leave basically, but I don't feel like that's what you're saying.
No, these are
so
not.
Could you explain what severance is meaning in this context?
Yeah. And I'm not familiar with all of the language in the contracts enough to say off the top of my head, but the contracts used to have language for things like unpaid vacation time or unused sick leave that might be able to be paid out at the end of the year, or for the number of years you were employed, there would be a severance payout for that.
even if it was just a traditional retirement.
And these are only for traditional retirements. This wouldn't be used if we would be asking someone to leave. That's not that kind of severance.
I did just want to clarify that since we
Yeah.
do have some visitors
Thank
in
you.
the
Thank you. I
meeting
appreciate
tonight.
that language clarification.
Thank you.
So now I'm leaving last year behind and we're in the current year. So here's some things we're starting to see in fiscal year 2021. The board might recall that the Department of Education, the Minnesota Department of Education, opened up the opportunity that some fund balances that are reserved for certain purposes might be released into the unreserved funds. So we're not talking about the OPEB trust, we're not talking about severance, those kinds of things. But there's a couple that we're interested in perhaps releasing this year, or at least talking about it, if we think we need these funds for this year's budget or as we move into next year's budget. We could have done this at the end of last fiscal year. We're not recommending it. I don't think we need to do that. We have until the end of this fiscal year to make some decisions about that. So we might, I'd like to get those decisions in place by mid-year if we can. So one of them is releasing the Early Childhood Family Education Reserve into the Community Ed unreserved budget. We wouldn't send it to the general fund, it would just stay within Community Ed. That's about $400,000. I'm not asking you to make any decisions or even consider it tonight, but just kind of put that in your thinking cap as we start to move toward the mid-year budget update. And then there's a reserve balance for basic skills in the general fund that we could reserve, or that we could release. We haven't been spending that down very rapidly, and that's about $860,000. So we'll talk more about that in November, but it's a couple of reserves that we might tap into if we think we need them for this fiscal year. So some things I'm going to spend a little more time on. We do have an enrollment decline this fall, and we are districts are experiencing this across the metro area. I meet with my friends in my position, my colleagues across the state and in the West Metro area every week. And everyone is having this conversation about enrollment decline this year. You know, families are making all kinds of different choices in this really odd year. So we'll want to be thinking about the impact on revenues and expenses as enrollment goes down. The number of families that qualify or have applied for free and reduced lunch has also been going down. We noticed that as early as last October, so October of 2019, already built into the fiscal year 21 budget was that declining number of free and reduced families. So our compensatory revenue has gone down. We already built that into this year's budget, but we're also starting to see, and I'm anticipating that our October 1 number is going to be down again. There's a couple of things happening. Last year, because we rightly do not deny any child a meal, whether they have a balance in their account or not, sometimes families who don't qualify for free and reduced lunch don't. So what happens is whether a family qualifies for free and reduced lunch and then gets a free meal, because it's all paid for in the state of Minnesota, or not, they're not having to pay for lunch. So we started to see that impact we speculate perhaps, our free and reduced numbers. And now again this year, because the USDA has extended the free meal program, there's really no incentive for families because the meals are free, regardless of whether you qualify for free and reduced lunch. We've been pleading with principals to get the message out, and I saw there's a headline on the website as well that we really are hoping that families will help us by go ahead and applying for free and reduced lunch. Meals will still be free. There's no stigma that is completely private information. We cannot share that information, but it helps keep things like our compensatory revenue numbers intact, because a lot of other funding formulas are based on that. But we'll start to think about what might happen, because I think that's just a natural occurrence and it's something that is happening across the state. My hope is that the state might recognize that as an issue, and perhaps we can look at the calculations for compensatory revenue in the legislative session. But in the meantime, I want to be planning for that with you. Another item is we might want to think about a fund balance transfer into the school nutrition fund, because they have taken quite a hit with the revenue losses and continuing to feed families. Of course, for every meal that's served, we do get state and federal funding, but we've lost revenue in a la carte and other areas for the school nutrition fund. Some of our additional expenses are covered through CARES and COVID-19 funding. We're going to talk about that, but not all. But we can't cover the lost revenue. So we'll probably be closing the school nutrition fund with a slightly negative fund balance for fiscal year 2020. I think I'm going to recommend we let that go, just so we can sit back and take a breath before we start moving funds out of the general fund and just kind of see how this year goes. But for the mid-year budget update, I might ask you to consider whether we should move general fund balance into school nutrition to help keep their budget balanced. At this point in time, we have time for them to catch up in future years. And if we can do that in a way that seems to make sense, I'd rather hang on to the general fund dollars. It's just so you know that's something we're thinking about. So our next steps for this fiscal year is we have to update enrollment projections. October 1st is sort of our date that we start to trigger enrollment projections from. The board will then be approving a mid-year budget update, and we are also implementing cost containment measures. Some costs naturally go away during a time of distance learning and hybrid learning. Some costs are going up as a result, but in any case, we're going to try to contain costs in every way that we can so that we can continue to bring the budget forward in the way that the board approved it last spring. So here's some things that we're starting to learn about the COVID-19 related funding. There's three types of sort of buckets for COVID funding. One is ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Act. And that is about $549,000. You can see the amount there, and you can see the period of time it runs through. And if you look at the GEARS funding, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief, it's about $86,000 in total. There's more on the next slide about that. And again, you can see the time frame. So that's for spending between March of 2020, about the time the shutdown happened, and we can spend funds out of those two buckets through September of 2022. What I want the board to know is we did spend some money last fiscal year, and our recommendation will be to just let that go. That will go into expenditures for last year if our budget can absorb that, and not draw on these two pockets of money. So we're kind of reserving that for these upcoming costs, because costs will continue through this year and through the following year. So just so you know that, and that is what is commonly being done in among our school district colleagues and peers. They're letting last year's, if they have the fund balance position and the room in their budget to absorb the cost from last year. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about and likely recommending. The coronavirus, and then there's the coronavirus relief funds. That's about $1.3 million. And we have to spend that in the next, within the 6-month period of July 1st through December 30th. So we're going to try to push all of the costs into that bucket for now, because we have longer periods of time for the other two. So just a little more information about that. Both the ESSER and GEAR funds have to be shared with the private schools in St. Louis Park Public School District boundaries. And so what we've calculated here are, in this second column, are the dollar amounts of our allocation that have to be reserved for private schools. And we've gone through the steps of checking with them, do they want to participate? And nearly all of our private schools are participating. We haven't spent anything out of these two buckets to date. Does not mean we haven't spent any money, but we haven't designated anything toward these two buckets because we really want to concentrate on the coronavirus relief funds because the timeline is so short. And over here, you can just see what the state has designated and as the usage of the funds. For coronavirus relief funds, we do not have to share it with our private school friends. Right now, we've got about $1 million worth of expenditures that we're considering and trying to put through the budget. We aren't really, it's all moving so fast that the Department of Education is having to approve every single expenditure, and we're trying to get a sense for what might be approved. So there's all kinds of things in this category. All of the personal protective equipment that's been purchased. We've got masks for staff that we've purchased, dividers that the students are using, all of the signage across the district, some costs for permanent subs so that we can make sure that we have reliable substitute teachers in place. I'm trying to think, there's all of the cleaning supplies and cleaning materials. We have some additional custodial staff that's been hired to help us keep up with the cleaning, some temporary custodial staff. We're looking at the idea of purchasing a food truck so that we can, for a lesser cost and into the future, continue to deliver nutritious meals that are at the right temperatures throughout the district. Additional transportation costs, those kinds of things. And we've got about $1 million that we're considering. And there are ideas and costs that continue to arise every single day. And Yuki Dozier, our new internal auditor, is pulling that all together and is really experienced with that kind of funding and budgeting, and is working with the Department of Ed so that we can understand what will be approved. So we'll continue to update you on these funds. It won't be, you know, a boon to the fund balance, because we plan, the intent is that these are spent or we lose them, obviously, and we will spend them.
It's like all the other budget buckets we have. They all have rules, and you
Yes.
can only do certain things with them. And Patricia, when we hit that part of the discussion, if you could just review that quickly as we go, that would be a big help to
I
our
will.
guests in the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, we will. Just gonna do a little time check. Okay, so this is our preliminary enrollment for this fall. And this was as of 9/24/2020, so it was last week, sometime Wednesday or Thursday of last week, we pulled this data. But here's what I want to get to. That's 132 fewer students than we had projected. So it doesn't mean that 132 students left. It was our projections that we would be at for this fall. So sometimes it does mean students left. It's going to take us some time for the systems to all catch up, for us to understand who's in private schools, who went to another public school district, who has moved out. And there's a presentation that I have done in December that gives an update about, that's about the time we'll know a little more information. But for now, we're down by 132 students overall. You can see that the biggest decline is in kindergarten, and that is exactly what our school district colleagues are seeing. And there's a lot of anecdotal stories about families either holding children back for another year because they can, families hoping to just skip the kindergarten year and start in at first grade. Families might be going to where their daycare has a kindergarten experience or going somewhere else. So we'll sort some of that out. And you can see by grade level and then by school what the numbers are beginning to look like. We did just bring in several more open enrolled students from our wait list, a few at Aquila in kindergarten and at Susan Lindgren across the board, a few at the middle school and also at the high school. So the numbers might improve a little bit, but I also anticipate that as we near October 1st, some of the students will start to see some declines as well as we start to understand whether students are here or not. They get a certain period of time before we have to take them off the rolls. So that's where we're at. That has a big impact on the budget. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So if you recall in June when we talked about the budget, we had foreshadowed a few things like we brought forward the budget assuming that COVID never happened. So most of the formulas and the projections we make in budgets are based on patterns from history or what we think we know. So we left the enrollment projections intact, not trying to pretend that we knew what was going to happen with enrollment this fall, for instance. So what I'm trying to show you here is that in June, we had foreshadowed that this column might happen in the middle, that we might lose 50 students from kindergarten, that we might lose as many as another 50 from other grade levels, that state aid might be prorated, which means the state would just hold back a portion of what we're owed in funding to balance the state's budget, because we're not quite yet knowing what the impact will be to the state, that there might be additional uncollectible taxes. And so we thought that the fund balance might be hit by as much as $2 million as a variance from what's in the current budget, what was in the budget we asked you to adopt in June. And what that would have done is that our fund balance would have dropped to 10.95% from what the board had approved, a budget of 14.25%. Which means that that's how much money we're holding in our unreserved fund balance that's free and clear to be used as a percentage of our expenditures. So it's just a way to measure a school district's financial health. Our board policy is 6%, that number would be 6%. So at the time, so as not to go into all of these changes and feel even more panic around the budget, because there is time to make adjustments. We moved forward with the budget as is. Here's where we think we are so far, and this is as of last week. We know that we're down 64 students in kindergarten. It's a little more of a decline than we had even foreshadowed, and the same in 1st through 12th grade, 68 students. I don't see, or really, I've not even heard any conversation about state aid being prorated. Those things can happen, and as we get closer to a legislative session, I think it would be surprising if anything like that happened, since we haven't heard about it yet, but I don't rule it out. So I just sort of leave that blank for now. The same with uncollectible taxes. Our property values have continued to go up this year at about a 5, 6, 7% rate. So I haven't seen anything. Hennepin County's been able to make all of the property tax payments to us. Other counties that have, we've heard different stories. So I don't see anything like that happening yet. So right now, we think with all of this being known and not making any other adjustments in expenses or seeing if there's any other positive adjustments in other revenue areas, we're down about $1 million from the fiscal year 21 budget. And instead of dropping to 10.95%, we could see fund balance drop to 12.6% based on just that enrollment decline. So that's something that we cannot have continue. We need to adjust our expenditures down to catch up with that, and that's something we'll be talking to the board about. But again, we have time, and what we want to do is gather really good data so you can be thoughtful about it. And if you look back on the budget timeline, we have opportunities to have those discussions in a really thoughtful way. So then I'm just going to jump into fiscal 2022 before I go over the levy. So here's some things we're thinking about as we begin planning for next year's budget that starts next July 1st. So I'm wondering what we might want to do about kindergarten projections for next year and the cohort survival for next year. I've talked to some districts who are assuming that all of their kindergartners will come back next year, plus the ones they lost this year. Some districts are assuming that all of those kindergartners are going to come in at 1st grade next year, every student that they lost. So I want to, we'll be thinking about that. I'll talk to colleagues. We'll talk about it at the Finance Advisory Committee. So it's going to be a different year for enrollment projections and that cohort survival model. Like I talked a little bit earlier about compensatory revenue, we'll know very soon what our estimate for free and reduced students are for this fall. That's the number. It'll be locked in soon, and that will be locked in for funding for next year. It's an October 1st data point. So we'll start to see probably another drop in compensatory revenue, just foreshadowing that for you for next year. So what I'll be doing next in our team will be preparing enrollment projections with cabinet, and the superintendent will be considering any necessary budget cuts that we might need to be talking about as we prepare for next year. And we'll also continue to think about the use of fund balance reserves. If we don't use them for this year's budget, might it be something we do for next year to soften the blow of the budget cuts as we recover out of this COVID time that we're in? So those are all of the budget updates I wanted to give you, and that's just a foreshadowing so you know what's coming in the budget. No decisions on any of that tonight.
Patricia, would this be a good time to take a little break for some questions before we move into the levy
Sure. Yes.
discussion? Okay, I'd like to start with one regarding the kindergarten enrollment numbers being down. I know that we're down, I think if you could go back a couple of slides, we're down 60 from our projection, 64
Yes.
from our projections. Okay, so I'm wondering, you know, those were just our best guesses based on
Yes.
birth data rates and what we typically see every year to year. I know you have a formula you use to help figure that out, but I'm wondering if there's been any effort made or will be any effort made to call or otherwise reach out to our 5-year-old families in St. Louis Park that we were somewhat expecting, maybe from, you know, other families or from kindergarten events, to talk to them about their plans for next year so that we can have a little bit more than just guessing to figure out if we should plan for a little bit higher of a kindergarten class next year, if we should plan for a jump in our first grade class.
Yep. Yep. I know that principals were making calls to all the rising kindergartners in the spring and over the summer, and we could certainly do that again. The other data point that will keep us from having to guess too much is we can see when we will know if any of our residents have gone to other public school districts through the MARS data reporting system. And then as we get lists from our non-public schools, we'll start to see which of our residents are in non-public schools, and then those that are homeschooling. So we'll start to get some data to see if our kindergarteners ended up in kindergarten. The group that we're wondering about, and I think phone calling will help, are those that held back for a year. Yep.
Just decided, I can certainly respect that. If I had to get a 5-year-old at home, I think I would have waited for a year to start kindergarten or just gone to first grade automatically. So yeah, I'll look forward to hearing what those conversations and the rest of that research lead to. Do any other board members have any questions right now? Anne?
I just have a quick follow-up on what you just said, which is for those families, if we do find that there's a number of families, which I expect that we will, who just didn't come in this year and are thinking about just sending their kid next year, is there going to be a way for us to help them assess whether their child is ready for kindergarten or first grade? This might be more of a question for instructional leaders than for you, Patricia, but just as we get, I mean, that's a few months from now, but thinking, is my child ready for kindergarten? Is my child ready for first grade? Like, how do we communicate those expectations for families so that they know what the best choice is?
I don't know if Aston or someone wants to weigh in. I do know that's a conversation that, you know, that we've had in the district about what our criteria would be to go to first grade and should that change. We do have the kindergarten screening that's in place that all of the rising kindergartners would go through, and that will be the same. That's one point of assessment. I don't know, Aston or others, if you have.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. And I have, you know, as similar to Patricia, I too weekly convene with superintendents all across the metro area, and we're talking about a number of different things related to the impact of the pandemic on our ability to facilitate learning for students this year. And this has been one of the conversations that has come up around, you know, kindergartners maybe going straight to first grade, and then how do you determine their readiness? So what we would do in that instance is that we would need to develop, and my hope is to learn from what colleagues from across the metro are doing, but develop some sort of document that we can share with families connected to the grade level standards at kindergarten. So really giving families things to look for, right? Can your child do this, you know, and kind of list out several of the different standard areas that we would expect a student that has just finished kindergarten going to first grade to be able to do. So we would certainly communicate something like that and then allow families to then make a decision based on that. But I do not anticipate that we are going to be creating any form of assessment that would either allow or prohibit a student from and a family from making that type of decision.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the preliminary levy. So the purpose of this part of the presentation is to review the Pay 21 tax levy so that we can prepare for the board to certify the levy at maximum later in the meeting tonight. And all maximum means is that gives us time to work with the Department of Education through June 30th, or through September 30th, which is tomorrow, since we have such a late board meeting this year, to make sure that we are levying for all of the formulas that we're entitled to. And it allows us to work right up to June, or to September 30th on that. So that's all that's about. And we cannot increase the levy after June 30th. In December, the board can decrease the levy in some line items. And the only way the levy could increase is if there were something that was voted on. We have nothing on the ballot this year to increase taxes. So what we have on June 30th, after the end of the day tomorrow, will be the maximum levy if the board certifies tonight. So there's 3 funds that the district, one of the revenue sources is the tax levy. That's the general fund, the community service fund, and the debt service fund. So the other funds in the district don't have a levy component, like food service, for instance. There's no tax levy involved in food service. So you can see that the bulk of the levy, almost 60%, is made up of general fund type revenues. The next largest amount, 38%, is in debt service, and a very small 3% of the levy funds community education programs. So this is just the big picture of the levy. This column is preliminary taxes payable, so payable in the tax year 2021. And this is revenue for 21-22 school year. We recognize it for next school year. This is last year's final levy that the board certified in December. You can see that the levy as we know it today is going up by about $398,000, about 1.21%. It's a very low increase in the tax levy. There's good news and bad news about that, depending on your perspective. And I'll talk about that a little bit. I do want the board to know that I'm working with our financial advisor and the Department of Education to increase the debt service levy. I can talk about it a little bit when I get to the debt service line, but it would be another $160,000 increasing in the debt service levy. That would bring the increase up to about 1.6%. I think I'm gonna be recommending that we hold back some debt service excess to for future years in the debt service levy. And I can tell you a little bit more about that, but just so you know that, it's one of the things we're working on in this last 24 hours here. These are all of the line items in the tax levy, sort of the summarized line items within the tax levy. Some of them are highlighted. There's lots of lines here and lots of funding formulas associated with this. But I highlighted some things that I think are interesting. That's either a change in law or something that's happening with our school district that you should be aware of. So the first line item, you know, the big story of the tax levy, I guess the big picture is it's not a very big increase in the tax levy itself. It's going to be less than 2%. Part of that is because we have a declining enrollment that we're projecting for this year. And then I foreshadowed that into next year as well, using just our normal cohort survival for now. I wasn't going to try to push up enrollment and impact the levy in that way. So that's one of the things that's happening. And then our tax base is continuing to rise in St. Louis Park. So we're going to see declining tax rates again this year. So that's sort of the big picture. So kind of into the details, the top line is our referendum levy. It's our voter approved operating referendum. That line item's going down by about $700,000. And we are at the cap at our current voter approved rate. It's about $1,846 per pupil unit. We have a decline. What we've done is driven this year's declining enrollment into this levy. So we're making that adjustment and taking that adjustment in this tax levy. And then we also are already foreshadowing what is a lesser enrollment than it might have been for next year. And so that's what's driving this decline. Now, the levy is very forgiving. So next year, if we're off in those numbers, it will pop back up again. So it always adjusts itself to actuals. We're still taking adjustments, for instance, for fiscal year 19 in this line item. The other line item, I just want to talk about the capital project referendum. That's also a voter approved line item. It's 3.812% of net tax capacity. So that one's going up because our tax capacity in St. Louis Park, the net value of all of our properties in St. Louis Park School District is rising. So that's going to result in an increase, and the capital project referendum is voter approved for technology. Operating capital is going up a little bit, and I just want to explain, you might think that logically that would go down with the declining enrollment because it's based on school district age, but it's also based on number of students, but it's going up because a shift in what's called the equalizing factor. So you get a certain dollar amount and the state splits it between aid and levy, and the equalizing factor shifted so that our formula is getting more paid through levy. So what's happening is levy's going up, state aid's going down. Total revenue has not changed for operating capital in this case. And then the long-term facility maintenance dollar amount is down a little bit from last year. It's going to be around $1 million a year. That's for deferred maintenance. It's just a line item in the levy every year, and you'll see an increase in the long-term facility maintenance debt service levy that we had talked about when we put that bond issue in place. So that gives you the totals. So the general fund portion of the levy is going down, driven mostly by that declining enrollment number. So this is the community service fund. I highlighted a couple of lines. There aren't big dollar amounts here, but I just want you to know that early childhood levy is going up just slightly, and that's also a shifting of the equalization formula for early childhood. It's a aid and levy mixed formula, and the levy portion's gone up. It doesn't mean that our early childhood numbers haven't changed, and the revenue formula has not changed. So we aren't getting more money. It's just more in levy, less in state aid. And then the school-age child care levy for students with disabilities, the cost to provide services for children who are in our after-school care program that have disabilities. What we do is just levy for the costs for that. So those costs have gone up. So overall, the pay 21 levy for the community service fund is going up by about $40,000. And debt service looks really complicated. There's lots of little ins and outs in debt service, but the big picture is it's the debt service schedule. So it's principal and interest payments that we're making on bonded debt over the years to build buildings, to remodel buildings, to put additions on, and they get paid off over 20 years. And so we have a debt service schedule, and most of them are voter approved tax levies. And we use the funds as we had promised the voters and then pay them back out of the debt service levy. So one of the things that is required in state law is that we levy at 105%. So we levy 5% more than is necessary to make the debt payments. That's written into state law. And so that extra 5% sits in a debt service fund, cannot be used for anything else, and eventually gets paid back to taxpayers. And that's what you see down here in the debt service excess. So there's a calculation behind the scenes that pays back that extra 5%, holding back a calculated amount that might be necessary. And then that's a reduction in the debt service levy in future years. So that's what I want to let the board know, that we're thinking of holding back about $160,000 of this debt service excess. So it would be only a reduction of about $27,000. It will cause the levy to go up a little bit more, but I think it will be wise for us to hang on to it for some debt service payments. And then we can make some different decisions either in December about whether we want to go ahead and let that reduction go through, or if we want to hold it and use that as a tax reduction next year. We'll never be able to hang on to it. It'll go back to taxpayers over time, but it's something that we can do this year to just give ourselves a little more time. Because what my desire would be is to even out the tax levy over time. And I would like to hold on to that reduction. Let's say that our enrollment numbers go up again next year. That operating referendum number will spike up. Then we'll have a little extra debt service levy to lower that impact next year. Does that make sense? So it's something that we can hold back so that we can keep our tax impact from flailing around so much. I'm working with Ehlers and Associates on that, and with the Department of Education. So the final tax levy in the debt service fund would be going up a little bit more than what is presented here. So then here's what's happening overall. The total levy is going up by about 1.21%. With that debt service excess I talked about, it would be going up by about 1.6%. The property values in the school district in its entirety are going up by 5 to 6%, depending on the calculation for the specific tax rate. But here's what happens overall. When you create a tax rate for an individual property owner, the total levy that's going up by less than 2% is divided by the entire property values, which are going up by 5 or 6%. So the result is we will have a declining tax rate again this year. We had that same thing happen last year. And depending on whether your individual home's property went up by more than 5 or 6%, it could be that your taxes might go up, but the tax rate itself will be declining this year. I don't have the exact calculations yet. We will have that prepared for the board and our taxpayers at the Truth in Taxation hearing in December. So like the bad news is enrollment's going down, which is causing a declining levy. The good news is it will result in a declining tax rate this year. So here's what the next steps are. Tonight, we'll be requesting that the board approve the levy at maximum like we normally do, like every school district, nearly every school district in the state does. That's the most expeditious way to get that done. Then we'll be sending preliminary levy data tomorrow to Hennepin County and the Department of Education. And then by November 24th, parcel specific notices come out. So they're not a bill, they're just, here's what your taxes look like on your individual property by November 24th. And it'll have an invitation on there to our Truth in Taxation meeting, which is on December 14th. And then the board will certify the final levy that evening, later that evening. So then this is just a reproduction of that slide that gives you an overview. So this is what we'll be asking the board to approve later this evening. The tax levy at maximum. And this is what the data look like as of today. I think that is the last slide. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. I would like to open this up to the board for more questions.
I have one request. Patricia, could you please go back to the two slides that have all the buckets, the line items? Some of them are highlighted orange.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Right there. So this is where it's important that our community understand every single one of those buckets has rules attached to it. And it's important when people say, well, why can't you just shift, you know, this over to here? We can't. The state does not allow us to do that. And if there's anything special that you'd like to highlight on this page or the next page, I think you alluded to some changes that we are allowed to make with that community ed fund. And I'll sign off here.
Yeah, so a good way to think about these are the ways that school districts are funded. And depending on the way state law is written, what the mood of the legislature is that year, sometimes the formula is written so that the funding comes to us through tax levy. Sometimes it's written so that the funding comes to us through state aid. And these are the ones where, in order to get the funding, it has to come through a tax levy. So that's what all of these formulas are. And so, for instance, alternative teacher compensation is our Q-Comp program. We participate in that. It's a levy and state aid. The majority of this funding, 70%, I think this is just 30% of the funding. And then I'm not exactly sure the percents. And then 70% is state aid. Reemployment insurance is to cover the costs for unemployment that we pay for staff who have been let go from the district and qualify for unemployment. Things like the Safe Schools Levy has to be used for crime prevention or safety. We use it for the cost of counselors at the high school and middle school. There you can see there's a small levy for other post-employment benefits, long-term facility maintenance, which has to be used for maintenance. So we can't take these funds and, for instance, reduce class size. It would not be allowed. And this year, as you had said, we're getting the opportunity in a one-time way to release it's fund balance. So it's not the levy itself, it's fund balance that has been saved over time in our early childhood program. So they get a certain amount of state aid and levy. The levy portion is very small, and then the majority being state aid, but they've created a fund balance over time. And as a one-time opportunity, we can release that fund balance into general community education, for instance. Otherwise, that is strictly prohibited. So that was a really rare pandemic type thing that came as a result of.
Like a tiny little gift.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we're trying to be really thoughtful about these opportunities that we have and make sure that we use our funds to support our students in the best way we can. Does that help, Karen?
I mean, I've been living these numbers for over a decade now, but I think what you did is walk our community through it. I see we have quite a number of guests attending who are probably not part of the FAC and don't necessarily understand that school district budgeting is quite different than any other kind of budgeting, whether it's a corporation or a family budget. We have so many rules that we have to follow, and that's just the way it is. So when we talk about contacting your legislators about the formula, that's where we get most of our funding. And the formula, that's going to be a discussion that you'll be leading with the FAC coming up very soon, because I believe Governor Walz has already signaled that it's not looking good for public schools with that formula.
Yep, that's right. And there's not the basic funding formula it has no tax levy associated with it. The bulk of our funding comes from a state aid funding source. Right, that depends on the state economy.
Which are taxes that community people pay. I mean, everybody in the state pays some taxes so that we all benefit from good public education. And our state legislature always plays with that percent, right? And some years, and this goes back to Arnie Carlson, folks, there would be a 4% increase on the formula, and then there would be like a 10% decrease on your transportation piece of it. And there were so many years in a row where we netted out 0-0. And so when you have to think a big picture of what's going on with public education and funding, we still haven't caught up from a decade's worth of underfunding. And there was a year when governor prior to Dayton, he balanced the state budget by restricting payments to school districts. So school districts had to borrow money because school districts can never not have a balanced budget. The state can never not have a balanced budget, but the state has more leavers to play around with than we do, because they have fewer rules that they impose, unlike what is imposed on us. And when you gear up for that discussion with the FAC members, it's really important that our community understand how complex this is, and it's very time consuming. And you and your team do a really great job. I'm so impressed with the timeline. I'm so impressed with the information that is very easy to grab at a moment's notice. It's just really thoughtfully done. But again, I want to remind the community, it's not simple by design.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Do we have any questions or comments from any other board members?
And I had one quick question. My Wi-Fi dropped out, of course. My modem decided to reboot in the middle of the meeting. I think it probably was excited to see all these numbers and probably having a hard time computing them. So anyway, but I wanted to get to my question, which was about enrollment, and was just wondering if you have some sense of what the timelines are. You've presented them in the past about when we typically look at enrollment kind of stuff, and so I might have missed what you had to say about, like, when will we be doing some checkpoints on enrollment?
Yeah, we check, we're looking at it every week, but a big date is October 1st. It's after, there's a 15-day drop period that if students haven't come to school for the first 15 days, then we drop them from the rolls. We think we have most of the students accounted for, but that's a big date, October 1st. And then I believe I'm scheduled in November to talk about that with the Finance Advisory Committee, and then with the board as well. And in December, I'd like to have the enrollment projections set for next year. So we'll have a really good idea in the next couple of weeks where this year's enrollment data is heading. And then that will be sort of the basis to start projecting from that. And I'm going to be convening with my colleagues in MASBO across the state, and we'll take wisdom from each other about how to impact the projections, and from Finance Advisory Committee as well. But by December, we should have a projection for next year ready and a really good idea, and we'll know what this year's enrollment looks like.
All right, Colin, does that answer your question?
Yep, I think that was it. Yep. I know you've done a whole presentation about enrollment that people have probably missed. And if they wanted to search for it online, they could go back and watch it, but it's pretty great to just see how we do this. And when you were talking about cohort survival, it sounds almost like a morbid term, but it is it's much about it, an accounting kind of thing, and thinking about what the numbers are and what that really looks like as we sort of project things and sort of look over time. And so it's not just, hey, where our numbers are great right now, how, is it going to stay great? It's calculating some of that into the factor. So thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else have any questions? Heather or Laura?
Can anybody? Oh,
I'm sorry. No, we can't. This is our school board meeting. And so unfortunately, it's not a public meeting such that we take questions from the public. So if anybody listening tonight has any follow-up questions on anything they're hearing, you are of course welcome to reach out to the board, or you can reach out to Superintendent Osai if it feels more like it is a kind of number specific question. And if we can't answer it, we will certainly be in touch with Patricia or her department who can help us get those answers for you. So that's the best way to be in touch with us about anything that you may be hearing tonight. Do any of our board members have any other questions? Okay, well, I am grateful that it seems that we can maybe close this out early. Patricia, do you have anything else you need to add?
No, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for coming and for keeping us in the loop on everything as it's moving and changing. We obviously need to stay abreast of the situation. So I appreciate that. And board members, I think that if anybody wants to make a motion to adjourn, this gives us all a solid 20 minutes to go grab a bite to eat and refill our water bottles and stuff before we head into the 7 p.m. session. So is there a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Anne? Second, anyone? I'll second. Mary's seconding. Okay, Laura. Roll call, please.
Mary Tomback,
Aye.
Ann Casey,
Aye.
Karen Waters,
Aye.
Heather Wilsey,
Aye.
Colin Cox,
Aye.
Laura McClendon, aye.
That passes 6-0. Okay, we are going to close out. There is a separate Zoom link, everybody, for the 7 p.m. meeting. So we will see you then. Thank you.